Buenas tardes a todos, gracias.
Good evening to everyone.
Y bienvenidos a
Thank
esta
you for being
primera
here.
conferencia
Welcome
del
to this
ciclo que nos
first
tendrá
lecture of the series
ocupados desde hoy,
that
8 de
will
marzo, Día de
start
la
today
Mujer, que
on the
tenemos el
8th
placer
of
de celebrar
March.
con Ariella Aïsha
Women's
Azoulay,
Day, we have
y
Ariella
hasta el
Aïsha
17
Azoulay
de
here
mayo,
until the
prácticamente
17th of
cada
May.
martes
Every
aquí
Tuesday,
en el Gallery
practically
Fundación
here
MAFE.
at the
El
KBR.
ciclo
And the
Restituciones,
cycle
la fotografía en deuda
Restitutions Photography and its past was conceived and directed by Carlos Guerra. And we thank you, Carlos, for your work and the fact that you've brought this to the KBR, a debate which seems to be very necessary, urgent, and important. I wanted to thank briefly on behalf of the MAFRE Foundation all the speakers that we're going to have in the cycle: Ariella Aïsha Azoulay, Teresa Paré, and I'll read them now. We will also, I must announce to you that the cycles of lectures, the series of lectures at the KBR from the beginning, which was directed by Marta Dow, are going to be accompanied by a publication which will be published, is published a few months after the cycle finishes, the series of lectures finishes. And finally, I want to point out that the Film Association of Catalonia is going to present a program about 3 of the lectures of this cycle: Hilda's, Anna Longoni's, and Michaela Janje. It's a pleasure to be able to work with the Film Institution. And Carlos, I'll pass the floor to you so that you can introduce the topic of the series and introduce Ariella. Ariella, welcome. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you here. After your lecture, we will have a Q&A session with the audience here and online. Thank you. Good. Thank you very much, Maria. And thank you to those of you here, those who are following online. I want to begin by thanking Maria Faf and Carlos Collonet for inviting me to be here, and all the team of the KBR that has worked so hard to organize this these 10 sessions, 10 lectures, and the collaboration that Maria's just mentioned with the Film Institute of Catalonia. And I want to also thank all the speakers that are going to take part for having been so enthusiastic and taken up this offering, this invitation. When I thought about the current status of photography, I never thought that the current status of photography would be so much influenced by the war that we are seeing by the minute on television and other media. I thought that the current situation that should be studied was the new reality in which there's a protagonism of images in our relationships, and photography is very important, transformed into new strategies of restitution. And when the French President Emmanuel Macron announced on the 28th of November 2017 at Ouagadougou University in Burkina Faso that he was going to promote a process of giving back from French museums to Africa things that were in those museums, he couldn't imagine what he was starting or what he was initiating. This process of repatriation, of giving back, of redressing, of even renaming seems to be a very obvious thing when it's a question of returning things to the place they were taken from. It is less obvious to think how photography can redress these situations, because photography is a very is made on paper. Sometimes not even the paper copy is in existence in our digital world. But when we look at reinstatement strategies in the field of photography, we soon discover that what is at play and what is involved is the creation of new rights. And we only need to look towards some of the most prominent cases of the 20th century to see that perhaps photography does not have as its priority that repatriation, that reinstatement, that giving back materially of objects, but enters a territory which is going to be very fertile, I think, and will give a lot of sense to photography. We're going to have to be creative to identify new rights and develop technical formulas that allow this to be possible. And that is the aim of these 10 lectures, really. 10 cases, study cases. We don't want to reach or to set up protocols for reinstatement. No, we want to point out specific situations which at each different time will give us answers that will sometimes be very local and specific. And in the presentation of this series, the reinstatement of photography, I made a note of the most famous case, which is the case of the photography of Dorothea Lange taken in 1936 in California of a woman who at the time her name was not known, and she and her daughters were in a picture, and this picture was the title of an iconic image, which was Migrant Mother. And this case has taught us, shown us how photography can at some times enter into or help help us to do justice in the face of intolerable situations. And this was the case of the commission of Dorothea Lange when she took that photograph, and that was taken in lamentable circumstances when many North American people were coming out of the Depression, the Great Depression. But that photograph in 1979, Florence Owen Thompson, who was in the picture with her daughters, put in a claim and said that that should be titled not Migrant Mother, but she should be named and her daughter should be named as the people in that picture. They were poor at the time, but they ended up being part of the middle class. And that claim of Florence at the Library of Congress was not responded. The Library of Congress said that the picture had circulated in such a way so widely, so had been printed in so many places and so often that it was virtually impossible to correct that title. So the Migrant Mother was condemned to remain that way forever because of that picture. And that is a case where we see how photography has contributed to visualizing injustice and at the same time has created a new form of injustice. And I think that in spite of the case, it's an old case and many other cases have emerged since, but it's a paradigm that allows us to see what paradoxes we have to face when it comes to these problems of reinstating property to their rightful owners. Of the 10 cases that we have included here, I'm going to summarize them. Maria has mentioned all the speakers, but I want to highlight and underline the fact that this is not, when you give something back, it's not because somebody's put in a claim, a human being has gone to court and put in a claim, but we are going to have to deal with a scenario where things will have to be returned on the basis of justice from the institutional point of view. And I think that we have a technical problem, a very important technical problem. How do we redress? we're dealing with natural entities or institutions, when we're talking about injustices that were made, that were committed based on climate change or the extinction of species. How do we do that? How do we go about it? We've got 10 cases that we'll study that would look at very many different cases, aspects, and we don't want to draw a clear conclusion or set up a protocol or write a manual about this. What we want to do is we want to gain inspiration so that we can creatively address these new situations where there are new rights that are emerging. And I think it is absolutely justified to begin this series with Ariella Aïsha Azoulay, who is a person who has been exposing and preparing the ground for this to be a current topic today, as I said at the beginning. And since she published the civil contract of photography in 2008, Ariella launched uh, or spoke up about the medium of photography as a way of capturing images, and she described it as a pact, an agreement between the photographer, the subject, and the camera. And I think that ever since then, until very recently, when she published Potential History, uh, we've seen that Ariella has really brought together political philosophy and photography to give us, throughout this presentation, tools to use photography as a place, as a scenario, as a space for new struggles, for new rights. Ariella, in fact, she's an artist, and she does a lot of projects where her intentions and goals are clear, very explicit. But she combines her work as an essayist, as an artist, and in Barcelona we saw the exhibition of journalism and photography. She was invited, Act of State 1967, 2007 was the exhibition, about 1,000 pictures where Ariella rethinks that systematic separation between the Palestine people and the Jewish people. And that is a long-term project, undoing that enmity between two peoples and recovering through photography the history of a society where both peoples, Palestine people and the Jewish people, had coexisted. So these projects that Ariella deals with would sometimes give us or make us think that photography was not invented in Paris, but in the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And that has led to a new way of understanding and analyzing photography, which is not just a question of taking pictures, but reading what exists, interpreting what exists, recombining, finding new meanings. And in addition to this, she's a professor of compared literature, modern culture, and the media at Brown University. But currently, she is a member of the American Academy of Berlin. Now, in addition to her books that I've mentioned, books which have been have a tremendous impact and been very important, not just within photography, but within political philosophy, social movements, or even they've helped to us to rethink the role of museums today. Ariella has done some films too, audiovisual pieces. I would like to mention Undocumented, which was presented within the context of the exhibition in 2009 at the Tony Tapias Foundation. Another occasion we had to collaborate with Ariella. She brought together projects reclaiming the rights of the natural history of rape, or different modes of essays where we saw how she addresses the technical, once again, but ideological and political problem of not having images of certain events or not being able to use certain images that exist, but that she would, whose meaning and significance she would wish to change. I want to leave it here, but I want to thank Ariella once again for being so kind to be here, to travel to Spain, to Barcelona, to do this presentation, which I think will be a magnificent way of starting this series of lectures. At the end of the lecture, we'll have a Q&A session and debate. Thank you, Ariella.
So thank you, Carlos, for such a generous invitation. And thank you, Maria, for having me here. And I'm really delighted to open this important series of lectures about restitution in the context of photography. I will need I want to time myself to make sure that I am not exceeding my time. Okay. It's Women's Day today, and the case that I will be presented is a case that was generated, provoked, led by Tamara Lanier, a very important case that she led, and she was able along the way to gather around herself many other people to endorse the case. And this case is still pending in court. I will say more about it in a minute. I think that it is more, well known in the US context, but it should be well known also here because it has European roots in terms of the wrongdoers, those who produce those images at stake. Would you mind to sit on this side rather than on this side, that I'll be able to? Thank you. The audience online is not aware of, but in terms of the spatial disposition of screens and chairs, it will be helpful for me if you will sit here. So I would like to start by presenting this case. I'm assuming that many of you know the image that we see Tamara Lanier holding in her hands. This is an image of Papa Renty, her great-grandfather, the great-grandfather of Tamara Lanier. And I decided to open with this significant image because it's not only his image that is familiar, because it circulates as the private property of Harvard University or the Peabody Museum, as a token in the history of slavery in the US. But here we don't see this image in itself as a private property held in museums, but we see the hands of Tamara Lanier holding her ancestor in her hands. So the title of my lecture comes from here, from this image, where we see actually Tamara Lanier saying, "Is my ancestor not a museum asset?" And what you see also, before I'm moving forward, what you see also in this, presentation, in this image, that I decided to open with, you will see the full image in a minute, so you will get to know Tamara Lanier. But what I wanted to emphasize through this image is that even though there is a restitution claim now, Harvard cannot prevent Tamara Lanier from performing their kinship, from holding this image as her ancestor, rather than waiting until the day that Harvard will relinquish the image and it will be restituted or repatriated, as I will present in a minute. So this image of Papa Renty was taken alongside other images of 7 enslaved people. All of them were commissioned by Louis Agassiz. in collaboration with a few other white males. Some of them were enslavers themselves, and those images were actually seized from those enslaved people in order to prove Agassiz, the scientist's polygenesis theory. So what you see here is the way that these images that were seized in 1850 are cataloged at Harvard. So you will see how they are being dealt with as private property. They are being cataloged, and you can see them at the Peabody Museum, but only one day every once in a while, because the daguerreotypes taken in 1850 are considered to be very fragile, and slowly the presence of the people who were captured in those images disappear, as happens to many other daguerreotypes. So here you see Tamara Lanier, the full frame from which I cropped earlier only Papa Renty and her hands. And until Tamara Lanier stepped forward and claimed that these were her ancestors, because we are speaking about Renty Taylor and his daughter Delia, until she stepped forward and claimed these are my ancestors, these daguerreotypes have been assumed to be the private property of Harvard University. In holding these images as part of its archival and museal capital, Harvard actually invites millions who are coming to the museum and around the world to view Renty, Delia, and the other enslaved people not as ancestors or relatives, but actually as enslaved people. And here I would like to make, a connection with one of the laws that were promulgated in the US, the Fugitive Slave Act from 1850, which is exactly the same time when the images were taken. And what you see in this image, in this drawing, is a parade. And in this parade, the two people in the front that are being surrounded by policemen or law enforcers, they are considered to be fugitive slaves. Which means that they ran away from the position that was forced on them to be slave, to be held as slaves in plantations. And when they ran away, people captured them, and they are about to be surrendered to the people who claim to be their owners. But why do I bring this image in connection to Harvard holding these daguerreotypes? Is because the Fugitive Slave Act is not only about sending back people who ran away from the position of slaves, but it is also about forcing everybody else to collaborate with seeing those people only as slaves. So what you have here is a parade in Boston in 1850 when the public is being shown what should be done with fugitive slaves. And what I'm arguing is that Harvard, by continuing to hold these daguerreotypes against Tamara Lanier's claim to restitute those images, actually force all of us under the Fugitive Slave Act to recognize Renty as the private property of Harvard University and of the Peabody Museum, rather than as the ancestors of Tamara Lanier. So there is the way that the law of private property that Harvard enact actually in relation to those images that operates on us spectators as those who are being invited or compelled to recognize in those images not ancestors but something else. So we have it here captured in a very eloquent and concise way in a poster that was prepared by Tamara Lanier and her daughter Shonrel Lanier. Renty is bound by Harvard, only 170 years enslaved. Since the abolition of slavery, he continues to be enslaved by Harvard, and this is part of the campaign to free Renty. So in 2019, as I said, Tamara Lanier, for the Women's Days, I couldn't think about a better case, Tamara Lanier filed a complaint against Harvard University. By endorsing Lanier's lawsuit, there is an opportunity now to redress what Renty and his relatives were deprived of in the 1850s. Saying it differently in connection to the Fugitive Slave Act from 1850, there is an opportunity here to reject the law that tells us to whom these images belong by endorsing Tamara Lanier's complaint. Lanier complaints was dismissed by Massachusetts court and the appeal is still pending. Several months ago, there was the hearing of the appeal, and as part of the hearing, I wrote one of several amicus curiae brief in order to support the case, and I also invited several scholars and curators. Carlos Guerra is one of them, to endorse the endorsement and to endorse the case, and all these texts were published in Hyperallergic. You are most welcome to read them and to get many more aspects of this question of restitution. And as you will see in those different texts that were published in Hyperallergic, how many nuances are in this case, but all of them share the same bottom line, that these images do not belong to Harvard. So the dismissal of the complaint is actually what can be called victor's justice. And when we speak about victor's justice, we have to recall, I think, Walter Benjamin's formulation that is said that when history is written by the victorious at the expenses of the victims and survivors, the spoils actually become cultural treasures. So he dwelled on this let's say on the processes through which violence is being translated into cultural treasures, and this is what happens now with those images. The Massachusetts State Court, actually by dismissing the complaint, confirmed not only Harvard possessions of the daguerreotypes, but also, and this is, I think, the most important issue for us to unpack, the terms and the stake of the case. The court decided that the main question is that of possession. And if you remember the first image with which I opened my talk, the image of Tamara Lanier actually performing that Papa Renty's her ancestor, we cannot assume that these images are a possession. And the only question is who owns this private property? Who owns Renty Taylor's daguerreotype? So by dismissing the case, we are actually attending to Victor's justice, which is the continuation of violence that was already perpetrated against victims and survivors. Harvard came to possess these images through a cultural logic of wealth, of property, and ownership that flows directly from slavery and preserves its lingering presence in our own era. So what we have when we are speaking about private property is a continuity between the regime of slavery that transformed people into private property and the establishment of photographs that are actually the outcome of an encounter between different protagonists, the transformation or the establishment of those photographs as the private property of those who own them or those who happened to own them. And as I said, Harvard possessed these images in connection to Harvard's involvement and investment in slavery. When we are speaking about Lanier versus Harvard, about this case of Lanier against Harvard, and when we read the complaint or the lawsuit, I want to pay attention to three three different terms that are being articulated in the lawsuit. So the first one is in article number 9. The plaintiff, Tamara Lanier, is a direct descendant of Renty and Delia. She has asked Harvard to recognize her lineage and relinquish the daguerreotype to her family. So I would like to dwell for a second on the term relinquish. Relinquish means voluntarily ceasing to keep something. And by using this term in the complaint, actually what Tamara Lanier, the way that we can interpret Tamara Lanier's approach is that she's offering Harvard a gift. So rather than speaking about Harvard should give back to Tamara Lanier the daguerreotype, Harvard is not going to give back the daguerreotype as if Harvard is giving something. The daguerreotype didn't belong to Harvard to begin with. And when Tamara Lanier approached Harvard 10 years ago and asked Harvard to enter into a dialogue with her before she filed the complaint, she actually asked them to relinquish the daguerreotype. She offered them a gift, how to transform their implication in the lingering effects of slavery and to do the right thing, to abolish the lingering effects and to free Renty. So this is the first term that is being used in relation to what does it mean that the images will no longer be at Harvard? And by that, what I'm trying to emphasize or to dwell on is that when we are speaking about restitution, we have to keep in mind the two sides of the restitution process. One of them is making justice with the victims, with the survivors, but the other one is interfering with or undermining the right of the wrongdoers to continue to hold what they achieved, what they acquired through violence. So it's not only about restituting the daguerreotype to Tamara Lanier, it's also about expropriating from Harvard what they acquired through violence. So now I would like to move to the second term in article number 17. The lawsuit seeks immediate restitution of the images from Harvard to Miss Lanier, just damages and other legal and equitable redress to be determined by the jury. So here we have the term of restitution, and when we speak about restitution, we are speaking about restituting something that was stolen to its proper owner. So we are speaking about an object that should change hands or should change place. And from this, I would like to go to the third term that is being used in the lawsuit, and it is repatriation. Without using it explicitly, this is what is at stake in article in clause number 18. It was an act of both love and resistance that Renty and Delia's kin kept their memories and stories alive for all over a century. It is unconscionable that Harvard will not allow Miss Lanier to, at long last, bring Renty and Delia home. So we are speaking about bringing them home. So we are actually speaking about repatriation or rematriation. We don't have to think about it only in terms of a homeland. We have to think about it in terms of the return of someone to where they belong. And I will come back to this notion of repatriation or rematriation toward the end. So actually, not property, but ancestors who need caretaking. And before I continue to this point, I just would like to go back for a second to the previous one. What is here is something that Tamara Lanier says often when she is being interviewed or when she's giving lectures, is that the memory of Renty Taylor was very vivid in her home, and she heard stories about Papa Renty at home from her mother. And when her mother was ailing, she asked her to to gather the story of Renty. And when her mother passed away, Tamara Lanier started to do a more profound dig into the history of Papa Renty, and this is how she came across those daguerreotypes. But we have to keep in mind that those daguerreotypes were discovered with quotation marks in the 70s by an archivist at Harvard University at the Peabody Museum, and when Eli Reichlin discovered them, and the discovered in quotation mark is not in relation to her, it's in relation to what happened to them all these years. And when she discovered them, she started a research that with the help of few Harvard faculty could very quickly lead to tracking down who are the descendants of Renty Taylors. Because when we are speaking about these 15 daguerreotypes, we're speaking about 15 daguerreotypes in which you have the name of the enslaved people, and you have the name of the plantation, and you have the location of the plantation. So it is not very difficult from the 1850 to track down who are they. I'm not saying that it's easy, but there is enough scholarship at Harvard, if Harvard were interested, to do the right thing in relation to those images. Rather than tracking down who are the descendants, Harvard decided to start to circulate those images and to perform the institution as the owner of these daguerreotypes, and also as the speaker or the accurate speaker on behalf of those images. And I think that this, contradiction between the capacity of Tamara Lanier as an individual to come across these images as her ancestor, and the way that Harvard, if they were willing to end their involvement in slavery, their capacity to track down the descendants and to make justice, the discrepancies between those two directions is very telling in relation to what is at stake here. So as I said, not property, but ancestors who need caretaking. So the question that I would like to pose in relation to those daguerreotypes, in order to stop relating to them as property and to take seriously these claims that the daguerreotypes are our ancestors, not images of our ancestors, I'm asking, what if we insist on treating Renty as the person who was used against his will for others to extract an image of his enslavement, rather than as the object that was seized from him? So saying it differently, rather than assuming what photography taught us, or what scholars of photography taught us for many, many years, or what institutions of photography taught us, that the image is the image of someone, and it is the property of the person who took it, we have to dwell in this moment when the images were seized from those enslaved people, and rather than already jumping into assuming that those are images of someone that are detached from the person, to relate to Renty at the moment when he's enslaved and he's being forced into the photographer's studio, and 7 different, white people are being involved in kidnapping them, actually, and forcing them to surrender their images to the camera in the photographer's studio, rather than assuming that the image is an image of Renty, if we dwell in this situation with Renty Taylor, actually, we have the opportunity to interact with Renty Taylor at the moment when this image is being extracted from him against his will. So what I'm trying to do is to suspend our embracement that this is an object rather than a person who is there and is deprived of the right and the means to say no to this seizure of an image. So if we treat Renty as the person who was used against his will for others to extract an image of his enslavement, we must ask where and among whom will Renty find peace and recognition of his rights, rather than who possess the image or to whom the image should belong. So I would like to go through 4 different points in my engagement with this case. The first one is the status of the photographs. The second is the question of the precedent. The third is crimes against humanity, and the fourth is kinship, repatriation, rematriation, and human remains. So I would like to start with the status of the photographs, the status of photographs in general. So Harvard's lawyers, when they made everything possible for the court to dismiss the case, they argue the rule is that a photograph is the property of the photographer, not the subject. And there are cases that we have cited in our brief, they are saying, that apply that rule even in cases when the subject of the images did not consent to the images being captured. So against this claim by Harvard that normalizes this particular way that photography was established or was institutionalized, I would like to bring 1 or 2 counterexamples. In the 1850s, photographers did not have exclusive property rights in the images they produced. So Harvard's claim is completely unfounded. Visitors to photographer studios, and we're speaking about many visitors because we are speaking about, an industry of images. Visitors to photographer studios purchased the daguerreotype produced by their presence in front of the camera, their daguerreotype, and they held them as their own little property, let's call it. But another case, which is more important and that arrived to court in 1860, 1 decade after the seizure of these images, Louis-Auguste Bisson, the official photographer of Napoleon III, was commissioned by the painter Adolphe Yvonne to take the emperor's photograph for Yvonne to use as a model for one of his paintings. When the painter realized that Bisson had printed many copies of the commissioned photograph, he feared that it would devalue his painting. He sued the photographer and he won, which means that the photographer was not recognized in court as the owner of the image. The court ruled that the photograph was the painter's property, not the photographer's. For redress to be possible, the statute of private property of such photographs produced through force and in the service of a regime of violence should be abolished. So what I'm actually calling to think is alongside this particular case that we have in front of us, the case of Tamara Lanier against Harvard, to think about the abolition of the regime that made of photography private property, or that made from all photographs private property. This regime should be abolished. And here, what I'm showing you is an image that I produced in collaboration with Jonathan Vinitsky, actually to show you the scene of crime, not the scene of crime of slavery, but the scene of crime where enslaved people that were already subject to extreme regime of violence were brought to this room, to this atelier, where actually they were handed over between those 7 men that I mentioned earlier, and their image was seized. So what you see here is that Alfred is one of the 7 enslaved people. Alfred is already in the process of disappearing. As I mentioned earlier, this is what actually we see with the daguerreotype is the departure of the enslaved people from the captivity of the daguerreotype. So what I produced here is inspired by their departure from those images, and an opportunity for us to not look at the body of the victim. This is an image that I will not show. This is an image, one of several in which the enslaved were forced to be completely nude in front of the camera, and to switch our attention from the body of the victim to the scene of crime, which is Zilli's studio. And I think that we have to start or to continue to criminalize photography in order to be able to take decisions, in order to be able to differentiate between photography taken under violence and photography that was not taken under violence, without starting to also criminalize things that are related to photography. We cannot abolish this regime that made from all photographs private property and actually compels us to be oblivious to the differences of the circumstances under which photographs were taken. Participants in violent photographic events or their heirs and communities, or initially denied the right to oppose the establishment of the regime under which images of captivity could be seized and arrogated from them, should be allowed to transform this regime so redress will be possible. And here, in connection to the abolition of the carceral nature of photography, or not nature, but the carceral dimension of photography, what I'm suggesting is something that I have developed already in different contexts for many, many years, is trying to oppose to or reject this separation between the tenses that makes photography to testify to something that have already happened. And what happened in this scene is that we have the photographed persons being denied the right to say no, to oppose, and to refuse not only the photograph that will, the daguerreotype that will be seized out of them, but the position that is forced on them, the position of a slave. And the event of photography is actually an event that produces an image of them as slaves. So what I'm suggesting here is to rethink this imperial temporality and to recognize the rights of those who are denied the right to participate in the way that photography will be established, to interfere today in this regime and to change its terms. So we are speaking about radical change of the terms under which photography was established. The daguerreotypes of Renty and Delia cannot be discussed with legal terms usually reserved for photographs, as they could only have been produced, those terms, as part of a regime that perpetrated crimes against humanity. And I will come back to the notion of crimes against humanity very shortly. First, I would like to dwell on the second aspect, which is the question of the precedent. A decision to allow Papa Renty to go home raises questions about how this might pertain to other objects held in our museums and archives and in similar institutions in the West. Here you see an image from a protest that took place not very long ago, in 2021, when it was discovered that the university acquired skulls from a catastrophic bombing that took place nearby. So it will not create a precedent since precedents have already been created. So all this fear that it will create precedents is actually part of a system that tries to make us believe that there is a slippery slope, and if Harvard will say yes, all the museums will be emptied with this kind of, apocalyptic vision of what will happen to the culture that, as we have already discussed it earlier, is entangled with violence and is being produced through violence. So it will not create a precedent. We are actually, we have actually several precedents. residents. And this is a, kind of very famous image from the end of World War II, where you see the Monuments Men, a special unit in the US and UK Army for what they called rescuing property in anticipation of restituting this property. And in this image, you see the hands that I cut. I cut the figures because I'm not interested in the specificities of those return case, but in the fact that they exist. And we see, the image is being, handed over from one to another. And the case of World War II, of the plunder of by the Nazi of property, and with a special emphasis on Jewish property, I would like to dwell very briefly on it. So for more than 75 years, a tiny part of plundered Jewish property, and I'm insisting on it, that this is a tiny part of plundered Jewish property, because so much of Jewish property was plundered when the Jews were sent to camps. So this tiny part is mainly works of art, meaning precious objects. And these precious objects are a paradigmatic form of private property. So for more than 75 years, a tiny part of plundered Jewish property has been restituted in the wake of Nazi expropriation and looting. And as an Arab Jewish scholar myself, I feel a personal commitment to ensuring that redress, restitution, and repair are not solely the province of Jewish victims, and are not only of what the imperial regime and market define as work of art. So I think that there are two wrongs in the restitution of Jewish property. One of them is the reduction of what was expropriated from the Jews to works of art, and the second is restituting works of art to Jews and not restituting to other groups that are claiming restitution. Such approach further exceptionalizes Jews at our own and other marginalized group expenses, and also overshadows the persistence of other forms of expropriation, not only works of art, that the market and the nation state is interested in making it spectacularly restituted. And now I'm moving to the third aspect, which is crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity create a racial order, aiming to physically and or politically eliminate groups of people from the shared world. That the victim's skin color made the crimes against them imperceptible to the white ruling minority is one of the major signs of a crime against humanity. And here I'm inspired by Hannah Arendt's understanding of what is a crime against humanity that she discussed in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. So it's about the creation of a racial order that aim to physically or politically eliminate groups of people from the shared world. And imagine now those 7 white people that I mentioned, some of them are enslavers, imagining them, bringing these 7 enslaved people to the scene of crimes, Zilli's photographer studio, and this happens in Floodlight Arena, right? This happened in the open. They are being brought there, but it is imperceptible as a crime. So I would like to speak about, photography in this context as also part of creating this racial order throughout the decades of when photography was practiced and slavery was practiced also, and what Harvard is actually doing by continuing to all these images to continue the effects of photography as part of or as implicated in the perpetuation of this captivity. So this racial order is an organized attack on human diversity, and I'm quoting from Hannah Arendt, an attack upon a characteristic of the human status without which the very words mankind or humanity would be devoid of meaning. A world in which only white people were allowed to determine who could be a property, a slave, what constituted a crime, and what is the ontological nature of a photograph, an image of violence, that should have been violence, not only an image of violence. And a world, sorry, it should be a world, and a world where the harm of non-whites was imperceptible, sorry, to the system of law they enacted, constitutes a sustained attack against human diversity. These crimes are committed not only against the victim, but primarily against the community whose law is violated. And here, coming back again to the Fugitive Slave Act, I think that, as you know, public of photography, we have to endorse this case because we are the community in which those crimes continue to be perpetrated as long as those images are being held as private property. And I would like to end with the fourth aspect of that I wanted to bring to the table in relation to this case. So it's kinship, repatriation, rematriation, and human remains. Lanier and Harvard are not equal parties debating ownership over a piece of property. This will assume that these are the daguerreotypes, that this is a private property, and we have two sides, and we have to decide who will own them. What we have here with Tamara Lanier is something that is incommensurable against the assumption that this is a private property. Lanier argues this is my ancestor, and these images were produced under violence. So these daguerreotypes were seized from Renty and Delia in a world in which, and here I would like to quote Hortense Spiller. Okay, so I still have a few minutes, 10 minutes. These daguerreotypes were, I think that I didn't close the timer, so you will exclude, yeah, it's okay. So these daguerreotypes were seized from Renty and Delia in a world in which, quoting from Spiller, flesh was for sale, flesh was summed up as a medium of exchange. Denying Harvard the property rights to what was stolen from her great-great-grandfather and his kin, Delia, is a way to repair kinship for Lanier, wounded by the long afterlife of slavery, to quote Saidi Artman. And here I would like to quote briefly from the session of hearing in court when Lanier and her lawyers appealed. The Massachusetts court judge told Harvard's lawyer during the hearing, "We have a property right issue here, whether it is you or they who get to control these images. That's the problem. It is not so clear under these horrible circumstances what your property rights are. I get your argument that their property rights require some very novel conversion of all torts to property rights. But I don't fully get your answer to Mr. Crump's, Lanier's lawyer, question to you. What is your possessory rights? And you are Harvard, employer of the wrongdoer, the cis, who commissioned those images. In between the employer of the wrongdoer and the descendants, that's tricky. Who has the right to this tangible piece of private property? What is your property right? Their right is not so obvious, but neither is yours. And you get to retain the possession, and we are not sure about it. So if kinship were possible, Hortense Spiller is saying, the property relations would be undermined. And here she relates to the property relation that made African-American slave. So if it was not achieved then, now, Renty and Delia were forced to enter a museum collection, and Lanier demands that they be repatriated to where they belong, among their relatives. Any technical or scientific explanation of the procedure of the daguerreotype cannot ignore that these daguerreotypes would not exist without the subjects being forced to have a portion of their naked skin open to the light and reflected onto the sensitive surface of these plates. These daguerreotypes are, in a literal sense, the remains of their presence, forced enslavement and unwilling nudity. So what I'm saying is that these daguerreotypes are the remains of their presence. So we are speaking not from another perspective. We are not speaking about objects, but we are speaking about objects as private property, but we are speaking about plates in which the human remains of those people are being kept. And we are speaking about images that are images of their forced enslavement, not of slaves, and also of their unwilling nudity. What was seized from Renty is congealed in the photographic image itself. It is a remnant of his present, an imprint of his flesh interacting with light that Harvard continues to claim as a museum asset. He is my ancestors, Lanier argues, not your medium of exchange. Lanier claims the restitution of the objects, but actually she expects the repatriation of her ancestors' remains. And I would like to end with this image. Renty was here, again, an image that I, in collaboration with Jonathan Winitsky, we assisted in materializing the departure of Renty from this captivity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariella. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Ariella. I think that really the case has been rejected. Can you follow me?
Can you come closer so you will? Estaban diciendo que a pesar
I
de
was saying that in spite of the fact that the case was rejected by the Court of Massachusetts, my feeling is that we have a very strong case, and that in fact, in this scenario of non-recognition by the law, there is another reason that has emerged, another argument that has emerged. And as we saw in the hyperallergic publication that you coordinated, there are many, many arguments, and some might look contradictory. But what is clear is that we know that these pictures are perpetuating slavery and of this couple, of these people, Renty and Delia and the others. So I think that what we're facing here is the limitations of traditional justice. We are in the face of a new sense of justice, and I don't know whether this is going to be we're going to be able to resolve this in court, or will this be whether it will be necessary to have a public debate about this in other areas, not just the courts. You've followed the case. What do you think, Ariella? What hopes do you have that this is resolved in court, or perhaps outside of the court?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I don't need to hear myself. Yes, thank you, Carlos. Indeed, it will not be resolved only in court. we can expect, together with Tamara Lanier, that court will, I don't know if it's the same system here, but in the US, she filed a complaint. And the court is at the first instance, they were not about to decide about the restitution case. They were about to decide if it will go to court and be heard in front of a jury. So this is what the court dismissed. So I think that it matters that it will that there will be a trial and there will be a possibility to actually unfold this case in front of a bigger audience. But obviously, this is not only for court. We know that many aspects of the legal system, of the international legal system, were shaped throughout centuries of imperialism, of slavery, of colonization, and we cannot rely on these systems to create justice. So one of the ideas behind, the way that Tamara Lanier led this case is to generate communities endorsement to the case. And when I was asked to write the amicus brief, I didn't want to be the only one who writes the amicus brief. So I reached out to 20 other scholars and asked them to bring their voice, not only to bring their signature. Because exactly for the same reasons, in response to Tamara Lanier, that this should create a wider debate. And the reason that I bring the term also, or the understanding of Hannah Arendt of the term crime against humanity is, first of all, it's obvious because when we speak about, slavery, it is a crime against humanity. But I bring in particular Hannah Arendt's understanding of it, because what Hannah Arendt is doing, and she did it in relation to the Eichmann trial, but it pertains to slavery in the same way, is that slavery is a crime that was registered in the bodies of Africans who were kidnapped from Africa. But this is a crime against humanity because it either violates the law of a community in which slavery could be possible, or it generates a law in which slavery could be possible. And in the case of the US, it didn't violate the law, it engendered, slavery engendered the law of the US itself as a state that was established by enslavers. Many of what is called the founding fathers of the US were enslavers. And when she speaks about crimes against humanity from this dual aspect, crimes that are registered in the bodies of the victims, but are actually crimes against humanity because the entire humanity is being impacted by those crimes. I thought that this is the way that we have also to approach what is going on here with these daguerreotypes. And on the one hand, to endorse the specific case that Tamara Lanier brings to court, but on the other hand, try to make it also a general case, because in this case, we have Tamara Lanier was able to track down her kinship relationship with Renty Taylor, but just think about the other images, or think about other, millions of images that were seized from colonized people or enslaved people that didn't track down their immediate relationship, but we have to understand that those images were taken under those conditions, that we have to abolish the regime that came out of this exercise of violence.
Efectivamente, justo recibíamos una pregunta a través. Creo que en cierto modo has...
Yes, I think you responded very well to a question that we've just got through the streaming on the chat. One of the persons here that is following us said property is important, but the value of pictures to denounce this crime, the pictures, the photographs allowed us to know about these crimes that were being committed. And these photographs are the evidence of those crimes. You've answered the question in a way, but what I would like to propose to you, so that you give us your opinion, these processes are opening up a new way of taking pictures, should lead us to renegotiate the terms themselves that led to a situation where these daguerreotypes were created. But at the same time, there are groups of professional photographers who are afraid of seeing their idea of photography restricted and affected by this kind of debate. Photographers that are afraid, they think that now their ability to take pictures of what they have in front of them is going to be limited because of these changes and these debates, don't you think?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. And yeah, some of what you're saying are exactly the premises against which I am arguing. Harvard, for example, in the hearing, they said that they are well equipped to show these images and to tell the story of slavery. But Harvard is part of the establishment of slavery, part of the regime that enabled this violence to become a regime under which people are being enslaved. So Harvard cannot deny the right of descendants of slavery to participate in the way not only that the history of slavery is being narrated, but in the way that the elements that were produced as part of slavery will be understood and will be will continue to circulate. So while it is important that we will use photographs in order to generate knowledge, it's not at any price, and it's not without negotiating what is on the table. And when you're saying that photographers are being afraid that their medium or their profession is being restricted, it is similar to what we hear in relation to restitution claim that museums will be emptied, etc. I think that the way that photographers were allowed to practice this profession with almost no restraint, with almost no limitations. Just think about the millions and zillions of images that are just around us in this city and in many other cities are being held by institutions that were seized from colonized people, that were seized from enslaved people. These images were seized by photographers. So it's good that the profession of taking photograph will be limited. It is good that it will be limited in a radical way, in a way that we can negotiate with those who were victimized, with the descendants of those who were victimized, that we will negotiate the terms under which images can be taken. So I am not afraid of photographers being afraid that their profession will be restricted. I think that it is very good that we will undermine the way that those colonial and imperial modalities of taking others' properties, others' images, others' lives will be stopped in a way that other premises, not only other laws built on existing laws will be changed, but other premises will be established. And what I propose in general in potential history and learning imperialism is that we have to engage with repairing rather than with producing more and more evidences of catastrophes, because we have to repair, and if we will divert our energy to repair, less energy will be also invested in creating the new catastrophe that should be taken in photographs. This kind of vicious circle should be stopped, and we are looking for ways to do it. And photographers have an important part in contributing to stopping this vicious circle.
Creo que hemos podido hablar más claro.
Good. I think that photography can be an accomplice and propagate catastrophe sometimes. Photography can be an accomplice. We have more questions in the room, so we're going to start with...
It's not only that photography can be complicit, but when we see the millions of images that were extracted from different people all around the globe, photography is not a tiny complicit. Photography is, photographers perpetrated this violence. So the question is how we negotiate, how we repair all this century and a half long of violence in order to set up different terms in relation to photography.
Damos paso a una pregunta que tenemos en la...
Good, let's go to a question in the room. Thank you for the presentation, which I thought was very interesting, especially because you are referring not just to photography, but the archive and historical materials as a whole. But that's not the debate. I wanted to say that I was struck. During your talk, you have referred to the couple Renty and Delia. We have not seen any pictures of Delia. Now, my question is, how do you explain that when you refer to "he is my ancestor," you only refer to him, to Renty? There's complete lack of visibility of Delia. I don't know whether photographs of her exist or not. But in the presentation, you have spoken, you have named Delia, but we haven't seen Delia. And I would like to know your thoughts about this, about the presentation and the figure and the discussion that has been put on the table. So part of my question would be whether the photograph, the picture of Delia, is also directly involved in this whole campaign and is as important as Renty's picture.
Yes, thank you for your question. I follow Tamara Lanier that in her lawsuit, she emphasizes Renty as the ancestor and his daughter. And so I follow her and I follow the way that she frames this lawsuit and the public campaign around it. And if my lecture will be longer, I will dwell on the images of the 15 other images, not necessarily by showing them. So for me, the engagement with these images is not about showing, because I think that we have to limit also the reduction, or we have to question the reduction of photography to the level of the visible. The reason, for example, that I didn't show the image of Alfred is because I will not show the image of his nudity. The reason that I will not show the images of Delia and Drana is because they are half naked in those images. So I will not show them anyhow in this context. I would, if my lecture would be longer, I would find other ways to speak about their images as individual images, but I will not repeat the act of showing them. So there are two aspects to the question. One of them is the emphasis on Renty, Papa Renty, and this is Lanier's choice that I follow, and I respect Lanier in this case. And the other one is about showing these specific images. So there are images of Delia, but I will not show them. If I had more time, what I would do is I would show Carrie Mae Weems' images of her, and what she did is intervening in those images in a way that enabled us to look at them. And as you, if you make a rewind of my lecture, you would see that in all the images of them that I showed, I try to follow something rather than repeating the act of showing what Harvard showed for so many years. So in this image, for example, that we still have on the screen, I'm showing this image in the hands of Tamara Lanier. In another image, I show the departure of the departure of the photograph person. In yet another image, I show the way that the images are being cataloged, and yet in another image, I show the way that Tamara Lanier transmitted a story that she heard from her mother, and probably her mother heard from her mother or parents, that she transmitted the story to her daughter, and together they created this image that again is not the image itself as it is held by Harvard, but it is the image together with the call free Renty enslaved for 170 years. So I hope this responds to your question from two aspects, the emphasis on Renty and the engagement with photographs.
¿Hay alguna pregunta más? Sí, tenemos.
Have we got another question? Yes, well, I first of all would like to thank you, Ariella, because it was a fascinating talk, and your emphasis on the situation beyond the object itself, and that ethics of restitution, which I think is key. And I was wondering, I was curious, is there any case with jurisprudence that is completely different? That is to say, a case where the institution has decided to give back freely and openly the rights of heirs of images like these. Is there a reverse case? Has there been any case where they have freely and openly given back? Because while I was following this, I was thinking to myself, I wonder if there are any institutions that have done the right thing without having been forced to do so. And another part of my question, another thing has to do with archives. We talk about archives, and this is an issue that has to do with archives. And at this point in time, I think this is tremendously important. I'm thinking about the issue of digitalization of archives, and something that Ariella, you've said, I think is very important. I'm not worried. I don't want to create now a moral discourse on photography, but there's been a tremendous reduction in the amount of photographers that take pictures on site in the field. And what we do see is that the social media are appropriating pictures of people that are not professional photographers, but there is also a huge amount of appropriation on social media and other areas. So the situation is in some ways getting worse in terms of symbolic violence. This is more a thought than a question, but anyway, I wanted to share it with you. And thank you for your fascinating talk, which is really revealing and important.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you for this question. There are institutions who are trying to perform themselves as doing the right thing. For example, we see libraries are saying we are digitizing everything and we are sharing with the public. What they are not saying is that what they are sharing with the public never belonged to them. There are institutions, even states. I think that Carles started with it, his presentation at the beginning, like France, that decided to restitute. So what they are doing is creating something similar to, photo opportunity when they restitute a few objects. They, for example, they have hundreds of skulls of Algerians in Musée de l'Homme. And they restituted, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, they restituted, I think, 25 out of hundreds. Institutions under the imperial condition are not doing the right thing. This is why when we speak about restitution, when we speak about decolonization, we have all the time to say that this decolonization is limited as long as we didn't decolonize the world. And I think that we have all the time to repeat it, even as it is obvious. We cannot celebrate those moments, as moments of, a change, because they are not changing anything. France, since this, report where the two scholars who wrote this report, Sarah and Savoy, recommended to restitute 90,000 objects. France restituted 20-something skulls and 22 objects that were looted from Dahomey, and still debating about a few other dozens of other objects to restitute, but the restitution is involved with imposing more of the imperial, premises, like you will have to build museums as we understand what are museums. So it's more about a propagation of the institution rather than undermining the institution. So unfortunately, the answer would be no. No institution is doing or can do alone the right thing, because for doing the right thing, what we have to expect is a true decolonization, of the world. And this is why, what I'm trying to develop, I didn't have time to speak about this obviously tonight, but what I'm trying to develop in potential history some premises for this, project of decolonization. And I think that what I'm saying is should not be understood. I hope it is not being understood as if I'm saying that we have nothing to say because the world goes wrong. No, I think that we have a lot to do. And I think that thinking about how we can go on strike on different levels, how we can sabotage the operation of these technologies. And I'm relating to museums not only as depositories of objects, but as technologies. So the question of strike, the question of sabotaging the operation of these technologies is what we have to do. And this is why also when when I engage with the case of Tamara Lanier, I fully endorse her, as I fully endorse any other restitution claims that come from individual communities or people. But I think that we have, together with each case, we have to see how we can expand it to some general guidelines or premises that will allow us to think across these cases, how we can refuse to collaborate with further configurations of violence that present themselves as the achievement of decolonization.
We've got a question here, and it will have to be the last one because we haven't got any more time. Juan says, Billy Wilder looked all his life looked for a picture of his mother who was a victim of the Nazis. Yes, I'll repeat because the microphone was turned off. Juan asks the question. Billy Wilder, the filmmaker, all his life looked for a picture of his mother who was a victim of the Nazis. Don't you think that those images of Nazi crimes were crucial for the identification of the murderers and the criminals?
Many things are necessary in order to criminalize perpetrators, and I will not make, photographs any different. I will not attach to photographs any special value in it. And even if they are helpful, we cannot follow only the infrastructure of the regime of identification for criminalizing the Nazi or other perpetrators. And it is very important for victims sometimes to have photographs of their dears, sometimes not. For Billy Wilder, an image will not replace his mother that was exterminated. So I think that we cannot make generalities out of the different roles that images can play in undoing the imperial technologies of death, as the Nazi regime was. This notion, or this ideology, I would even call it, of the documentary that images tells us about those crimes, actually denies the fact that those crimes are being perpetrated or have been perpetrated in the open. And there are survivors that know about this and can be the ultimate source of acknowledging what happened, that are often being dismissed for different reasons or for different expectations of the legal system to what can be the ultimate proof of a crime that has been taken place. And I would like to maybe end my answer with in relation to those images that I spoke about. What we have is not an image of a crime, but this is the crime, right? This is part of the crime. So we have to think about those images metonymically and not to expect them to tell us the truth about something else. We have many sources in order to generate the truth if there is a willing to acknowledge the truth. And sometimes images are being mobilized or are being treated as if in them, like in an archival document, we will find the truth. The truth is not located somewhere, and it is not located in an image. The truth is something that we have to generate together. And those images are not just, we don't have to accept these images as telling the truth of something else. We have to relate to those images as partaking in our capacity to generate a certain truth. And in this case, it is not about identification of identifying Renty Taylor or knowing that slavery took place in the US. We know that slavery took place. We don't need another document to tell us that slavery was a horrible regime. We don't need any other image in order to support the case for reparation for slavery, and yet there are no reparations for slavery. So we have to relate to these images as metonym or samples of this violence, and not as speaking about violence on which we don't know.
Creo que con esta anotación final,
I think that with these final words, there could be no better way to finish this first lecture, with which Ariella has really, well, she's given us a tremendous case here, and we will have more cases that we will examine, and we will probably I'm sure they'll be very interesting. And this lecture is an extraordinary way to begin this series. Thank you very much, Ariella, and thank you to everyone who's been here in person and online. Thank you very much and good evening.